Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another Talk Architecture podcast episode on form making in art and architecture and what are the differences and similarities. We start off the first topic that has to do with functionalism. Now, my take on functionalism is that because there is a need to look at architecture in terms of how it functions, the inside of it, the adaptability and flexibility that architecture could do for the users. The users able to manipulate the space to be able to have these new types of users, use or new types of function. And it was apparent that at the turn of the century, when there were more factories, you can't do classical architecture as the form making, aesthetics for a factory, or you can't do certain aesthetic principles of the old vernacular architecture for something that is perceived to be a new thing, a new era. There are types of buildings emerging. For example, schools of architecture in the past, if you were to look at the Glasgow Mackintosh School of Architecture, Design, and the Arts and Crafts tradition, the architect would think, okay, what is there? What could we do with the new materials? We have glass, steel, and we can span the glass, wider, and we can let in more light, and we can have skylights, and we can have all sorts of terraces, and we can elevate it. We can put pillar tie underneath, and we could have it more open with the ideas that Le Corbusier introduced. And why do we get stuck with the old material of bricks and and stone? Concrete is fairly new, or being done in a new way, although it has been around since the Roman times. But concrete is seen as something that's flexible, and you could explore cantilevering, and you could do, you can span much more wide, larger spaces without having columns in the middle. So the idea of what you could do make the architect think about this new way of form making, more true to the use of the material itself, and the idea that functionality is something which can take off, and dictate what form making would be. So this topic on the role of the Bauhaus and functionalism in how we do form making in architecture and art is something that is became essential. It became like it break the rule, or it surpasses the expectation of how we look at architecture. Now, many of what architecture education curriculum now adopted from the past came from the Bauhaus, sincerely because of this attitude to architecture form making. Before we have digital architecture and artificial intelligence and AI generated images now, where we could also build architecture that is curvilinear, or it's not rectilinear, and is much more fluid right now. It's another debate. But the point I'm trying to make is that we were still doing manual drawings at that time until we had digitalization since the 2000s, 10s, and recently. So what I could learn from this is that when I was doing design, I learned the traditional way. We work with sections and plans and perspectives, and we can sketch perspectives. We can actually do models, right? Now, don't forget that we did that not long ago. And then we go back to the plan, and then we go back again to the models. But the plan, that two-dimensional drawing that we can envision in our mind how it would look, how it would be developed, what the elevation is going to be like, and how the 3D will be developed, is often a rectilinear object. It's often to do with, for example, in a tropical country like in Malaysia, we cantilever it, we create shade so that the shadows are deep, so that it won't be so hot with direct sunlight and glare and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to do is that it's very functional, isn't it? I'm trying to explain that we are reacting to the environment much more. How did they get from we reacting to the environment more to a more artificial type of solution, or a form making that is relying on mechanical and artificial conditions, is something that the client dictates. They would say, okay, we don't mind spending more for mechanical and air conditioning and so on. The client would say, okay, this is still uncomfortable in this microclimate in the middle of the city. We still need help with air conditioning a lot. And the customers would complain that we don't have that. So there are these decisions to be made. And what it is that since we can just clad everything or wrap up everything in a box and air conditioning it, we can just do whatever we want in terms of the form making. Now, that is another question with regard to decision making and cost implication. What I would like to go and talk about is how we did not think about that way. Traditionally, we were designing from the plans, and traditionally we wanted to make it as functional as possible. And the aesthetic was born from functionalism or functional aspects. Basically saying that form follows function. Now, it's about taste, and it's about style, and it's about decision making from the client's point of view, and whether the architect would like to argue that. There are architects with signature aesthetics, and they could argue that the client needs to follow their aesthetics because, well, signature or not, their aesthetics would be more practical, more... Well, it's a matter of selling it, the selling point, right? Whatever that you believe in, we're not judging what is right and wrong. We're just looking at how the process is being made in coming out with the aesthetics. The architect could negotiate that form follows function and function is king, and form will just naturally be servant to the function. And there you go. You have an architecture that serves its purpose in terms of functionality, very much help the client to feel the well-being of being in this building, feeling the cooling effect if you're in tropical hot country, feeling nature to be inside of it, and feeling that it grows with you and so forth. I'm not making a judgment call, although I'm partial to this sort of architecture, but what I'm trying to do is that the decision making in terms of the plan will impact on the aesthetics or the form making. We always think about the plan first, although students of architecture may like to get stuck in the plan because the tutors would be... This is the habit that has been in the past, where the tutors would look at the plan and how it works and whether it doesn't work or not and the functionality of it. But there are also that forcing the student to actually quickly decide on the aesthetics and coming up with 3D models. And this has been of late the practice in architectural education that is pushing the student to come up with the 3D model earlier and asking for the student to actually provide some wow factor with the three-dimensional aspects of it. And sometimes students of architecture would not go through the design development as much and come up with the form making too early. This is in keeping with the education that has diverted away from the spirit of the Bauhaus and the spirit of designing and developing from the plan. What are the repercussions and what are the fallout when this practice is being done more? So there's less of functionality, there's more of form making or getting architecture for aesthetics sake. The principles of aesthetics, shall we say, is the principle of the architect or designer that is doing or designing. What are the principles of aesthetics that they adopt and engage with? Do they spend enough time to do the plans? So if student of architecture taking too many shortcuts in designing and just go for the 3D modeling before they go for the plans and getting the plans right, so they will practice this in architecture practice. So if you have them graduating and that's the way they design, and they go into architecture practice and they feel that architecture is not for them because this is a traditional way, this is the way that architecture is done, which they had shortcutted themselves. So who is to blame? So functionalism and what came out of the Bauhaus was helping architecture to look at architecture from a very practical and user-friendly and functional way. And we always felt right about this design process in which we conduct it like that. Only recently that we find architecture students and graduates not being able to be confident in architecture practice because they were taught wrongly, or they were allowed to skip and just produce architectural renderings based on whatever architecture digital software that they have, and they get good grades for it. But that's why architecture education is divorced from architecture practice. And this is my reasoning. This is my argument with what is happening in the state of architecture right now. So why is it's an important conversation. You zoom out and you thought about form making in art and architecture. There is this confusion going on with regard to architecture is art, and and the nuances. The problem is in actually understanding what people in the past or architects in the past having leaving the insights on what is actually the right way to do architecture. I mean, architecture has gone away from the architecture roots, and this is tiring. If you are a director or you are an associate and you are supervising graduates who come in and they're kind of frustrated that they can't get it right, and that drawings that they process to the site architects or the things that are incomplete and deemed to be unusable, what is the mistake? The mistake is not really understanding how to design in plan. Now, I would put this argument right there and then up front forward, because I can see it happening. And I mean, I sound like somebody who is kind of frustrated at the moment, but the policy of getting students to be enamored by digital architecture and softwares and 3D rendering and modeling without understanding about the plan is the biggest mistake in architecture at the moment. In architecture education at the moment, precisely. So, though we have digital softwares, we have all these things to help us, still the traditional way of learning architecture and designing from the plan, fine, you have all these tools and equipment to, softwares to get you technologically correct. But if you don't have that sensibilities of how to design, and not just putting things together in a way that you think speculatively. So the need for the architect to get back into designing and be able to command design is something that is lost here. I mean, of course, designing in plan, I mean, let's go and break this down properly. When you design with the plan, you're also thinking about mechanical and electrical accommodation and how you're going to design your architecture along with them, or how they are going to be accommodated and stuff like that. You are thinking about environmental or climatic design. You're thinking about sustainability, use of materials. You're thinking about a lot of things when you design plan. Because plan is a section that is to do with the horizontal, and section is for the vertical elements put together. So, how many of these curvilinear buildings or these formulas of architecture is going to be around, and how are they going to be adapted to future needs? So we can see that buildings in the past, in terms of sustainability, you can use and reuse them again. But buildings which are formless and they're not really in keeping with, shall we say, principles in how to use them in the long term, adaptability and flexibility is not going to be. It's not an ESG thing, shall we say. It's not a good environmental governance, and even social governance. It cannot be adapted to different functions. That's one of the things that we think about buildings and complex buildings, because we put a lot of money for them, and then after that we demolish them. Economically, it doesn't make sense. So this is the thing about architects, in which other professions are looking at us, and we are serving the clients, and we need to be much more sensible in our approach to architecture, where we even can do, shall we say, studies on the feasibility of different forms and shapes. People have the money, they can build whatever they want. I mean, there are those star architects and those buildings out there that is published, in which You can splurge on things, but they're not the norm. And the norm is the everyday. And sometimes we don't have architects dealing with some buildings. They just get built. A lot of architecture out there is just simply utilitarian or utilities facility. So anyway, aesthetics is something that we need to get to understand even more deeper, because we're losing out in terms of creating, letting go of our command or control of the aesthetics of the environment, and how the aesthetics of the environment affect us mentally. And out there could be visual diarrhea, so to speak, in terms of the urban design. And even so, it becomes more frustrating when it's not functional and there is lack of accessibility, lack of usability, and that's another one, which is safety, in fact. So we need to be much more accommodating to universal design principles, embrace them, in fact, with regard to families, children, nursing mothers, elderly persons, and which is make up of the, shall we say, 60% of the population, or even almost 80%. I mean, well, okay, 60% would be good, or 70%. So let's put it out there that functionalism and the Bauhaus was a good lesson to learn about architecture and how we should go and move on to actually make the architect much more serving well for society, in which regard that functionalism has taught us lessons, and moving away from our bread and butter, the thing that we're good at, is not a good idea. So hence the design process is very important to get it right. So, and the decisions to be made and not just copy. Thank you very much for your interest on this subject.